So my name is Jess Schulschenk. I'm Director for the Sustainability Institute, and I also head up partnerships for the Embedding Project in Africa. My experience the last 10, 15, 20 years originally started in climate science, and from that I quickly learned about and wanted to make better sense of the role that we play as humans in the rapidly changing world. And so that led me into sustainability and ultimately into corporate sustainability. So that's been the focus of my research, my PhD, and my teaching for the last 10 years. The Sustainability Institute is a non-profit trust. We've been going for over 20 years. We've got a long-standing partnership with Stellenbosch University and work with them in the delivery of a degree program in sustainable development. Our work is really about learning for just and generative futures. So when we think about sustainability, it's both about the environment, this incredible planet that allows us to live and to be, but it's also about really important questions of social justice and equal opportunity within generations and for future generations as well. It's a really big question. And I think it's difficult for many of us working and living in the African context, where often some of the narratives coming from the global north are about climate, the climate crisis, as a big environmental challenge. And it certainly is. But I think we really have to recognize the contribution that we've made as humans, and that contribution has not been fair. So some countries and companies have contributed disproportionately. And the other element of justice or fairness is that many people, most of whom contributed least to the problem, will be most affected. So for us, it's a climate crisis, but until we center issues of climate justice, I think it's a conversation that many people don't see as relevant to them, and that's concerning. I think we have so many social challenges that we are trying to figure out, whether it's about inequality or access to education, healthcare, good jobs. And we can be reductionist or over simplistic about it and see environmental and social and economic issues as separate. Or we can see the incredible opportunity that lies in bringing them together. And if we are to start to innovate and understand the challenge, we can also understand opportunities that can help us to advance on social needs while working within what we're terming from a science perspective, planetary boundaries. And we need to do both at the same time, advance and build social foundations and protect, adhere and work within planetary boundaries. And this is something that Kate Raworth is referring to as a just operating space for humanity. So how do we do that as countries? There's a lot of work happening globally around cities, but I'm especially interested in the role that companies can and need to play in that transition. So there's two trends that I want to speak to. The one is the way in which the world has shifted, and the other is the way in which companies are responding. So the first one that's really important is we find ourselves in what's been called the decade of action. We basically have until 2030 to make some really fundamental changes to our economy and the way in which we use resources. And I find it helpful to take a step back and ask why. What my understanding of this is over 100 years ago, we discovered this phenomenal energy source, fossil fuels. And it has allowed us to do incredible things, build cities, international travel, all kinds of things. The challenge though, is we have used so much of it in such a short period of time. And the negative consequences are the greenhouse gases that are accumulating today. So we as a generation did not start this, but we are dealing with the consequences of this decision. And we need to make a fundamental shift away from fossil fuels to renewable energy resources, which is huge. That's really changing the whole dynamic of our economy. And we have the double challenge that many of the promises of the economic models we live with today were that there'd be a trickle-down effect, that everybody would be better off. We're not seeing that. In many cases, inequality is worsening, and we know inequality is bad for everyone. So we have this double challenge or opportunity that we need to respond to. How do we move to a low carbon economy? We have to halve our carbon emissions by 2030. And if you look at any global firm today, they're making significant commitments to be able to achieve that. And we need to do it in a way that builds opportunity and inclusivity for everyone. So that's the way in which the world has changed. And I've really noticed over the last 6 to 12 months, many companies waking up to this. And to be honest, being a bit overwhelmed and feeling on a bit of a back foot. So we've got companies who historically have had long commitments to understanding complex social and environmental issues. And to be honest, they're a little bit further ahead. If we look at some of the big firms today, Woolworths has just come out with a massive commitment to be carbon neutral by 2040. But even companies in some of the major extractive areas like Exxaro have made commitments to a net carbon neutral future. This is huge. And what we're waiting to see is what are the patterns of capital allocation? How are companies not just saying they're going to run the race to a low carbon and inclusive future, but what are the steps that they're actually taking to move us away from ad hoc projects and pilots, which are important and they'll get us started. But we fundamentally need to see shifts in core strategy and the way in which companies develop their core products and services in order to operate in this carbon constrained future. So if I were to think about that from different industries and different trends that we're seeing in terms of company responses, I think those that are literally closest to the coalface are those in the extractives. So mines and anyone thinking and working in energy is hugely affected. The drivers there are partly customers, but I'd say to the most extent it's investor pressure, both local and international. So we're looking at concerns around things like stranded assets, investing in a coal-fired power station that may be shut down in 5 years' time and not seeing a return on that investment, which was anticipated over a 20-year period. We think and are noticing that legislation is slower to catch up. So actually investor pressure is a much harder driver than legislation, but legislation changes are coming and we can see the writing is on the wall. And then I think those industries that are much more consumer facing, we've noticed a huge shift in consumer expectations. As a company, you can say that's fair or unfair, but it's the reality. And so how do you make sense of and have a really proactive, well thought through, considered position, not on every issue, but really on those that are most material to your core business, as well as the ones that you have the potential to play a positive role or influence in. And so whether that's in retail and food, in telecommunications, specifically we're seeing really big innovations in the finance industry, making very bold and clear commitments. And so I think at this time we find ourselves in a commitment space. Companies are making commitments to be part of this transition. Those need to be well thought through and very carefully communicated. There's a big danger in doing that inadequately. And now next we need to see how we move from a pattern of projects to really seeing this as integrated into core strategy, decision making, and ultimately the products and services that any company delivers. If I look across the industries we work with and the many kind of multinationals we're involved in research with, what I've noticed is actually there's not a specific industry that's leading, nor can I say that there's one company who's perfectly getting this right. There tends to be, I was expecting with the early days of my research to find leaders and laggards. These were the good companies and these were the bad companies. And if the bad companies just did what the good companies did, we'd all be cool. And it was so much more complicated than that. There were leaders who were very good at communicating what they were doing, but when you scratch beneath the surface, there wasn't deep commitment, there wasn't really a change in how they were operating. And so that's a form of greenwashing. And I think increasingly people are understanding and picking that up, even just if at an intuitive level. On the other hand, there were companies who weren't talking about this at all. And they had some incredibly progressive commitments in terms of their core investment strategies, internal position statements, and yet they were nervous to take a position on it. And so I think a term you shared with me was this idea of green hushing, so not talking about it. And we need to find a much healthier middle ground. So aspects of leadership that we're seeing, that I'm seeing across industries, whether it's in finance or extractives, food or retail, is a leadership commitment on key issues that is publicly communicated through position statements and supporting goals and targets. We're specifically looking, for example, on climate, water, hopefully soon on biodiversity, for commitments around science-based targets and adherence to the TCFD frameworks. And there's a lot of work to be done on some of the social issues. We need to have better ways of understanding our contribution and our role to play in addressing inequality and inclusion. So I wish I could point to and say these companies. We do, for example, the Embedding Project has a searchable database available for free, where you can go and have a look at what we consider to be some of the best position statements and goals available publicly from companies across the world. Maybe have a look and see if your company is there, and get to know what you're committing to, what is already being put on the table, and ask better questions. We see that as a key role of leadership. You don't have to solve it all yourself. These are complex issues. A lot of collaboration is needed with research, with science, with the private sector working with the public sector, with civil society. It's really what we're terming wicked problems. No one person or group of people created these issues by themselves. We're all affected by them, and no one person or group of people can solve it by themselves. So we have to work together. But leadership for me is taking a clear position and committing the resources to be part of the solution. So I think sustainability has a really bad rap. A lot of sustainability narrative is about giving something up, about doing better, being less bad. And that's not the most inviting or interesting story. And it doesn't trigger a lot of interest from people, or it doesn't really invite people into deep systemic change. And so much of our work is around exploring narrative and storytelling as a powerful mechanism to invite people into the journey with you. There is only so much you can do through the direct operations that you control. And we're seeing a lot of work upstream in the value chain. So once you have your own house in order and have the integrity with which to engage with your supply chain, we're seeing very important work happening now with contracting, policy, and supplier development. But to your point, what we're missing is that kind of meaningful engagement with customers, communicating complexity with enough simplicity, because these are big, scary topics. So how do you simplify without undermining the story? And how do you craft a story that is honest, that's fair, that's relatable, that's humble, but that invites people to be part of the journey with you? People are feeling quite scared at the moment. They're feeling overwhelmed, and even just for myself personally, unsure of what the future holds. So insofar as we can invite our customers to be part of this journey together, ultimately consumer behavior is one of the biggest mediators of whether we'll have a sustainable impact or not. And I think often of Unilever. They could have done so many things with their washing powder, but one of the biggest changes they recognized was by developing a washing powder that could run on cold water, it would have the biggest sustainability impact or change. And so we need to start thinking about how our consumers experience our products and how we can support them to make decisions differently that are in their best interests, but that are also easier decisions to make. So I think that's an amazing area for development, and it should be exciting. We should get excited about telling inviting, interesting, awesome stories that help us to do things better. What a lovely opportunity. So I think there's also just a big challenge that we have in that, to be honest, a lot of the sustainability impact is from excessive consumerism. And it's a hard thing for companies to make sense of if you're in the business of selling stuff. So technology has an important role to play. We can certainly be a lot more efficient with the resources we use, and tech is an amazing way to do that. So yes, renewables, yes, electric vehicles, if done carefully and in a considered way, if we look at the whole life cycle. Smarter agriculture, but that, I'm not promoting a green tech, green revolution approach on that. But there's so many amazing innovations that can come from tech. Tech alone is not going to help us solve the scale of these challenges if we don't start to ask some really uncomfortable questions around excessive consumerism. And I do think that companies have to look in the mirror and ask whether the products and services that they're offering are really advancing quality of life, and that, are they supporting and setting people up to make better choices, or are they undermining them? So the Patagonia example, I get pushback on because it's an exclusive, expensive brand. Yeah. And so I love it, and I really appreciate the work, for example, that Sealand Gear is doing in South Africa with upcycled old sails and advertising billboards and turning it into extremely durable bags. Yeah. So kind of one bag for a lifetime is a massive move against kind of excessive consumerism. but we have something that lasts.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that there's Satish Kumar, he's this exceptional kind of, I would say a spiritual leader, founder and director for many years of the Schumacher College. And he talked about all products having 3 attributes: purpose, durability, and beauty. And I think that's such a beautiful mantra. And you can be profitable, you can be successful as a business and still create things of purpose, of durability, and of beauty. I think, we did a massive CEO study a couple of years ago and tried to understand, it was a question we were being asked by the companies we were working with: how do you influence executive leadership and CEO decision making? And so we had this amazing opportunity, ended up interviewing about 200 global CEOs, board chairs, heads of sustainability strategy. And I remember being in a room with one of the CEOs of our largest financial services institutions on the continent. And he said, we need to be able to stay in business. So profits for us it's not a bad thing. So we had this debate around profit. And I completely agree. The business of business is business, but at what cost and over what time frame? And I think that's where we're seeing a big shift away from short-term profit maximization at all costs, because those externalities are currently biting us where it hurts. So to live and operate in a society that is unstable, that is being shut down because of social unrest and riots, to operate in a context where we don't have stable soils, water supply, energy supply, is really dangerous to business. And this is the big shift we've seen, as sustainability is a nice to have, something peripheral, to understanding businesses' dependency on these contexts. So we're talking about a shift towards contextual strategy. And then trying to think about our products and services within that and asking whether they are kind of contributing to the problem or whether they're a part of the solution. And we need to make that shift to slightly longer time frames when we think about profit. Mm-hmm. So it's not to deny profit, but it's to think about how and under which conditions are we creating it. Mm-hmm. So I love tech. It makes so many things in my life a lot easier. Certainly on a personal level, there's a lot of things around too much social media, too much that. I think if we look at companies and industries as a whole, tech is a massive enabler of efficiencies and an important part of the solution when it comes to renewables and the transition to a low carbon economy. My concern is if we put all our eggs in one basket and we think that tech alone will be the solution, we're missing the bigger picture. Tech is a tool and it's up to us how we use it. But my concern is that it's not going to address some of the really big questions that I find myself and others asking. For example, excessive consumerism. A lot of the sustainability challenges we see today is that we're simply using a lot of stuff in very inefficient ways to meet perceived needs that maybe a lot of us don't actually have. So I'm not against, by any means, profit or making profit. Many of the business leaders we've engaged with, of course this is important. It's why and how a business exists. But if we are focusing only on short-term profit maximization, and we're not paying attention to the massive social and environmental externalities, we will continue to feel the impact of them. And I sense we're feeling the impact acutely already. So social unrest, ecological breakdown, these are affecting businesses' bottom lines right now. And so the progressive businesses that we're working with recognize their dependency on social and environmental systems in order to operate. They're moving away from seeing sustainability as a nice to have or an external project, but realizing that unless they're part of creating the conditions for a stable society and a stable environment, the risk to them is not having a business to be able to run in the next 5-10 years. So this is really hitting home, and I think it's one of the big drivers beyond just investors, consumer pressure, changing legislation, is a deep internal recognition that strategy has to shift. And until we recognize the ground on which we stand and which we depend on, our strategy will be shaky, it'll be unstable. And we need to think a bit differently about the role we play in society. Are we part of the problem or are we part of the solution? So I was mentioning a bit earlier, we did this phenomenal study with CEOs and global chairs a couple of years ago. And so it was an amazing opportunity to learn from their journeys and firstly appreciating the pressure that they're under. They have all this responsibility and huge accountability, but it's often we talk about it's lonely at the top. And so the first thing I would say, what set apart leaders who are really able to take a position and lead on this, because your company is looking to you, your board is looking to you, your investors are looking to you, is those that recognize that they don't need to do it alone. So surround yourself with good people who you can trust, who can do the research, figure it out with you. And your job is to ask the right questions. So yes, there's definitely a need for building your awareness and understanding. We've recently produced a fantastic, very short series of videos on climate risk for directors. So we'll point you to that. There are short courses and training programs, and we've seen some phenomenal changes when companies have been able to get all of their executive leadership and in time the company as a whole through training and awareness. It really helps just lift, a rising tide lifts all boats. And then I would say, I'll think on a couple of resources and I'll maybe share them as links with you afterwards. But it should be an enjoyable journey. Seeing this as something that is certainly big, it's certainly a bit overwhelming. But I think in reflecting, what I've noticed in the leaders that have embarked on this journey is how deeply rewarding it's been. Young people coming into the world of work today are looking for this, and they're willing to put their shoulder behind the wheel. Your customers, your investors, your communities, they celebrate the opportunity to do this with you. And there's ultimately a tremendous legacy to be made by having made the right decisions at the right time, which is always impossible to know. But I think at some level, our heads know. And if we take half a moment, I'm sure our hearts know as well.